A girl of 19 with everything she owned lashed under a wagon sheet, a stepmother already counting the good rooms of the home ranch and the going freight business hers behind a locked office door, and a single folded deed to a dead white sheet of alkali the whole camp called the Poison Flat and swore was the deadest, most worthless ground in the district. That was the entire estate that came down to Naomi Corbett on the raw gray morning this story begins, and any man in the silver camp of Cascabel would have told you, kindly and to your face, that it summed to exactly nothing, and less than nothing once you counted the taxes. Every man in Cascabel was wrong. That bitter white flat, the one the freighters spat toward, and the cattlemen fenced their stock away from, and the whole camp used for the very byword of ruined ground, was going to make her the richest single holding in the whole district. Not someday, not slow, but inside one single burning winter. The winter the reduction mills drove deeper into ore so rebellious it would give up its silver to nothing on this earth but salt, and the salt they roasted it with came thinning and failing all at once from three sides, while out in the valley a killing early snow drove the ranchers to slaughtering and salting down their herds to save anything at all. One winter when the whole country, mill and range together, ran clean dry of salt, and the only bottomless bed of it for 40 miles lay under the flat that everybody had been so glad to give away. And the soft pink land agent who laughed across his counter and pressed $40 on her for the folly as a kindness would drive out onto that flat himself before the worst of that winter broke, his hat held against his chest and a syndicate's money folded in his coat and thousands of dollars on his tongue, to ask her please to sell it back. She would name him his own $40 for the whole of it, with the heavy season's ledger lying open on the plank between them, and she would tell him she would sell for exactly that and not a copper more, the day the brine ran dry and the desert sun went out. That is where this story is going, and it earns every cold white mile of the road there. If you have ever been handed the one thing that nobody else in the world wanted, and made it worth more than everything they were so careful to keep, then do me a kindness before we begin. Tap that like button, leave a little word down in the comments, and tell me what country you're listening from tonight, because I do dearly like to know how far these stories carry out over the mountains. It was the tale of a hard summer in 1874, high in the dry ranges of the Great Basin, in a silver camp called Cascabel, that had grown up in a matter of 4 years in a fold of the desert mountains where a spring came down out of the rocks just barely enough to keep a camp alive. A place of 1 bank and 4 saloons and a mercantile and an assay office and a great deal of pale, grinding dust, strung out under bare tawny peaks that held silver in their veins and almost nothing else a body could use. And the silver up in those veins was the mean kind, the rebellious kind, the kind the old Cornishmen and the Mexicans on the mercantile porch shook their heads over. Not free gold you could wash in a pan, but a hard sulfide ore locked up tight, ore that would not give its silver to quicksilver alone by any coaxing, but had first to be crushed and roasted red hot in a furnace with salt thrown to it by the ton, roasted until the salt bit into the ore and turned its silver to a chloride the pans could catch, and only then run wet and hot in the amalgamating pans below. Roast and pan, they called it, and the whole beating life of the district ran on it, and the one thing that process ate, over and above wood and water and men, was salt. Salt by the wagon load, salt by the season. Salt hauled deer over 2 mountain passes from the great salt marshes away to the west, so that a mill's salt bill stood second only to its payroll, and every teamster in Cascabel had at one time or another cursed his mules up a grade under a load of the stuff. There was not a soul in that camp who did not know, if you stopped and made him think on it a minute, that the Mills lived on salt. It simply had never once occurred to any of them that the salt might be got any nearer than the far marshes over the mountains, and it had certainly never occurred to a one of them to go looking for it under the dead white flat they had all agreed, years back, would grow nothing and hold nothing and kill whatever wandered onto it. Ezra Corbett had been dead 9 days when the will was read. He had been the quietest man in the district, and maybe in that whole quarter of the desert, a lean, sun-cured, unhurried man with pale, steady eyes, and a habit of standing a long while looking at a piece of ground before he ever set foot or tool to it. A man who had freighted and prospected and at last put together a small, honest ranch and a share of a freight line on the good grass at the mouth of the canyon, and who dealt square and spoke about one word in 10. He had come into the country a widower with a small daughter, and had made his place hauling and holding while other men chased the silver and broke on it. And he had married again, 5 years back, a handsome, upright valley woman named Cordelia, who had buried one husband already and knew the price of everything under God's sun to the penny. He took a chill in the wet cold of a desert winter storm, out on the flat past dark, seeing to his ponds when he ought to have been by a stove. And it went down into his chest and would not come out, and he was gone inside of 10 days, gone at 50 odd, with an apology to the doctor for the trouble he was putting him to. And the whole camp said, what a pity, a steady man like that, and then went back to talking about the price of salt and the grade of the ore. When the will was read out at the long table in the ranch house, it went about the way the camp had guessed it would, because Cordelia Corbett was not a woman who left much to chance or much on the table. The home ranch passed to her whole and entire. The tight, snug house, the barns, the good spring, the standing grass, and best of all Ezra's half of the freight line down on the road, the wagons and the teams and the going contracts, the one truly paying thing the mild, unhurried man had put together in all his years. All of that to the second wife. What was left over for the daughter of the first marriage was one folded square of paper, and it was a paper Cordelia would not have troubled to keep if it had been the last deed in the territory. She did not simply pass it across the table. She rose and came round to where the girls sat, and she pressed the deed down into Naomi's palm and folded the girl's own fingers shut over it, with both her cool, dry hands, the way a lady presses a coin on a beggar in front of the neighbors, so the giving will be seen and remembered and told about. And she said the one thing she troubled to say to her that whole morning. "There is your father's folly," she said, in a voice with no heat in it at all, which was worse by a long way than heat. "You are entirely welcome to it, every bitter acre. See what you can raise on it that he never could." Then she turned back to her chair and her lawyer and her good rooms and her wagons, and the matter, so far as Cordelia Corbett was concerned, was closed and swept. And a girl of 19 sat at the only table she had ever belonged to, holding a deed to the one piece of ground in the whole country that the camp used as its very measure of worthlessness. Everyone in Cascabel knew what the folly was. 6 years back, Ezra Corbett had paid good hard money at the land office to file on a broad white alkali flat that lay in a basin an hour and a half's drive out past the mouth of the canyon, a dead-level sheet of it, a mile and more across, blinding white under the sun and gray as ash under a cloud, crusted over hard on top so a wagon would ring going across it, and treacherous soft beneath, for under the baked crust in places lay a cold black brine mud that would take a horse to its belly and hold it. Nothing grew on it. Nothing grew for a good stone's throw around the edge of it, where the alkali salted out into the soil and burned the grass off and left the ground puckered and bare, and the cattlemen had learned the hard way in the early years to fence their stock well back from it. For a cow that grazed the poison flush at the margin or drank at the bitter seeps, bloated and staggered and died, and more than one had. It killed grass, and it killed cattle, and it would swallow a careless team, and the camp had 100 names for it, none of them kind, and the one that stuck was the plainest, the Poison Flat. And they would ask Ezra, grave and friendly on the mercantile porch, whether he meant to cut his hay out there this year or only run his fat steers on it. He let them laugh. He had been laughed at before and had long ago noticed it cost him exactly nothing, and most every Sunday, in his good dark coat and his wide pale hat, he hitched the mule and drove out the long white road to his folly with a rod and a level and a notebook and a cold dinner, and he measured. He measured for years. And what the camp never once troubled to drive out and see, because it never once entered a single head in Cascabel that there was anything out on the Poison Flat worth the seeing but a dreamer's mistake and a good way to founder a horse, was the thing this whole story turns upon. And it lived now in the girl's memory as she sat at the table with the deed cooling in her hand, because her father had shown it to her himself, more Sundays than she could count. The camp had it exactly backward, and Ezra Corbett had known it for 6 years. They all looked at the flat and saw dead ground because nothing green would live on it, and by the only measure they owned, will it grow grass, will it run cattle, the flat was indeed a folly and a poison and worth precisely nothing. But there is more than one kind of worth that can lie in a piece of ground, and the very bitterness that killed the grass was the sign and the seal of the thing that made the flat worth a fortune, if a body only knew how to read it. For the poison in that white crust was salt, not the clean table kind up on top, but a foul alkali crust of soda and bitter salts baked hard over the whole floor of the basin. And Ezra, walking that flat with an auger and a shovel and his patient level, chain and rod and notebook in hand, had proved to his own quiet satisfaction the thing almost no man in that district would have believed if you had shouted it at him, that under the bitter surface crust, down where the auger bit through the poisoned skin into the cold dark below, lay a deep clean bed of near pure rock salt, laid down when some old sea dried away in that basin 10,000 ages before there was a camp to laugh, and standing in and above that bed a heavy, dense, sweet brine, a natural pickle strong enough to float an egg, holding more good salt dissolved in every barrel of it than a man could credit until he had boiled a panful down and weighed the white heap it left. And the getting of it cost almost nothing, which was the beauty of the whole thing and the part the camp would never have believed, because the desert itself did the work for free. A man had only to lead that brine off into shallow ponds and let the fierce dry sun and the tireless desert wind draw the water up off it, and the salt would grain out on the pond floor in a clean white crop the sun had harvested for him, to be scraped and washed and dried and sacked. And beneath, where the brine ran slow, the solid bed lay waiting to be quarried out in blocks, sun and wind and brine, working for nothing, on a mile of flat that lay full of salt the way the camp's own veins lay full of silver. And every mill in the district was hauling its salt 2 passes over the mountains and cursing the price of it. Ezra had begun the works with his own hands. Sunday on Sunday, he had cut a leader ditch off the strongest brine spring and thrown up the low earth banks of 2 shallow graining ponds and floored a little drying platform of plank. He had run his stake lines the length of the flat where the ponds were to lie, true stakes standing at every station with the grade marked on them, and he had filled a notebook, patient Sunday by patient Sunday, with the figures that proved it out, The assay of the brine dipped and weighed from a dozen holes across the basin. The grains of salt, a barrel of it would yield. The depth of the rock bed sounded with the auger, the pond grades and the fall of the ground, and the plain reckoning of how many tons of clean salt a season of desert sun could grain out of those ponds if a body would only build them. Every figure of it set down in ink in his small, square, unhurried hand, because that was the mother of all his rules and the one he had drilled into his daughter past all forgetting. That you write every figure down in ink the very moment you have it, every degree of the brine, every ton, every dime, and every egg, because a figure set down in ink cannot shift on you in the night the way a figure, only remembered, always will. Salt in a country that will always need salt, he told her once, mild, screwing the cap back on his little bottle of ink, will outlast the silver that is only lent to it, and he taught her, Sunday on Sunday, out on that white flat, to read a brine and a pond floor together as one thing, which spring ran strongest and sweetest, where the sun would draw fastest, and where the poison crust would taint the crop. How to run a grade with a level and set a stake dead true. It was Naomi, all 5 years of the second marriage, who had quietly kept the paying books of the ranch and the freight share, while Cordelia kept the parlor, tallying the loads and the teams and the beef and her own eggs and butter in a square hand her father had trained on her. So the woman who folded the girl's fingers shut over the deed that morning was turning out of doors, though it would be a hard white winter before she understood what she had done. The one soul on the whole place who could read what Ezra Corbett had spent 6 laughed at years proving in the crust and the brine of that flat. Naomi did not weep at the table. She rose and put the deed away inside her coat against her ribs where a paper belongs, and she went and hitched her father's old mule to his old spring wagon. Cordelia let her take the pair, not from any mercy, but because they were past their best, and the letting go of them would read as generosity to the neighbors, and Cordelia Corbett never once in her life let go of a thing that did not read, in the letting, as finer than it truly was. And Naomi drove, not out toward the flat, but straight down the dusty length of the camp to the squared stone front of the bank, because paper before work was her father's law. You prove the title clean before you spend $1 or 1 day working the ground it stands for. The bank and the land agency in Cascabel were the same soft desk, and the man behind it was Ezekiel Pryor, who was banker and land agent and notary all in one comfortable person, pink and round and easy in a good broadcloth coat, with a heavy gold watch chain slung across the front of him like a trace chain across a gap. A man who priced every soul who came through his door in one single downward glance, and never afterward troubled to price them a second time. He had priced Ezra Corbett years back at not much, a dreamer with a poison flat he would never make a dime off. And he priced the daughter cheaper still, a girl with a dead dreamer's alkali and no man to stand at her shoulder. But he took the deed when she laid it on his counter, because paper was his trade, and he was genuinely good at it, and he read it over with a great deal more care than his comfortable pink face let on, and what he found was exactly what she had ridden down to hear. The title clean, the filing true, the taxes paid to the very year, the whole white flat passing plain and entire out of her father's name and into hers without a flaw in it anywhere. Then Ezekiel Pryor leaned back off his counter and laughed, low and easy from under the watch chain, and made her the offer this whole story hangs upon, the offer men in Cascabel would repeat to one another with a wince all through the winter that followed. $40, he said, and I call that handsome, out of pure respect for your father. Rest the man. It is the only offer that flat will ever draw in this life or any other. Child, let me take the poison thing off your hands, and you go hire out somewhere respectable and warm, before the snow flies. Naomi took the deed back off the counter, squared its fold, and put it away again inside her coat, and told him, level, unhurried, in the plain voice of a body finishing an ordinary errand and not refusing a kindness at all, that she was much obliged to him for confirming the title, which was the whole of what she had driven down to learn. Something dry moved behind the banker's comfort at that, because a kindness declined is a thing a man like Pryor files away in a bottom drawer and does not forget. But he only smiled and told the room she would learn the hard way. They always did. Out behind the mercantile, out of the wind and out of the watching, Naomi counted her money. It lived in a tobacco tin that had been her father's, and it was egg and ledger money, careful money, saved a dime and 2 bits at a time out of hens she had kept, and books she had squared, while Cordelia never once troubled to notice the work getting done. And it came, counted twice over in the cold, to $41. 41. She sat a moment with the open tin on her knee and let the figure be exactly what it was, and let herself feel the plain, hard shape of it, because a true figure has a shape a body can lean on. The girl the whole camp had just finished pitying owned, by her own honest count, $1 more than the banker's entire opinion of her inheritance and every acre of it. 41 against his 40, and she meant, starting from that one proud dollar of margin, to widen it into a sum the district would choke on before the sun came back. There was one man on the mercantile porch, as she brought the wagon back past it, who did not laugh with the others. An old desert teamster named Tobias Flint, gaunt and gray and near 70, who had freighted salt and ore and everything else over both those passes back before the camp had a name, and who leaned on the porch rail with his cold pipe and watched the gray wagon climb away up the white road out of camp with his pale, sharp eyes, and never said one single word. And there is generally, in any camp, one old man who says nothing, and he is generally the one worth the listening to. She did not turn the mule toward any warm, hired place. She turned it out the long, white road toward the flat. An hour and a half of it, past the mouth of the canyon where the good grass gave out and the ground began to pucker and pale, out to where the basin opened and the great sheet of alkali lay blinding, and then as the sun went down the sky, went the color of ash and then the color of bone. She came up onto the hard crust in the last gray light of that short day, with the cold already pooling down off the peaks, and the flat opened all around her, dead level and enormous and still, the wind hissing thin across it and not another living thing in sight. She let the mule pick its way careful along the firm ground her father's own Sunday wheels had marked, up to the low bench on the north edge where the strongest brine spring seeped. And there in the failing light she found the thing that closed her throat, his Sundays, waiting for her out in the cold. Below the bench lay the 2 shallow graining ponds he had begun, their low earth banks squared and true and part dug, the leader ditch cut off the spring and waiting for the brine to be turned into it. And downslope she could just make out the line of his pond stakes marching away across the flat, true, and plumb, the grade marked on each one in his hand, the strings between them long gone, but the stakes standing faithful in the dead ground. There was the little drying platform of plank. There was a low pole shelter and a ring of stones for a fire. She got down stiff from the wagon and walked the lines he had laid in the near dark, and knelt at the lip of the leader ditch where the brine stood cold and heavy and black looking in the dusk, and she put her bare hand down into it. That dense, bitter water her father had spent 6 laughed at years proving would grain out a fortune in white salt under the free desert sun, and held it there until it stung and burned in the cold. And if she wept, then the thin, dry wind took it off her face before it fell, and no soul in this world was owed the seeing of it. She did not stay knelt long, for there was a little light left, and the cold was real and coming on fast. She pitched the wagon sheet over the pole ridge in the lee of the bench, penned the mule with fodder she had brought, and made a small fire of the greasewood and dead brush that lay everywhere for the gathering, and ate cold bread by it while the last gray drained out of the enormous sky and the first hard stars came out cold over the flat, and the wind went on hissing across the salt the way it had hissed for 10,000 years before anyone was alive to call the place a poison. And before she let herself sleep, she took out her father's notebook and turned past all his years of Sunday figures to the last page his hand had ever written, the last brine assay he had set down, dipped and weighed in his small square ink not 3 weeks before the chill took him, and just beneath it, in the same hand he had taught her, she wrote the day, the date, the miles out from camp, the $41 in the tin, the mule and the wagon, the 2-part dug ponds and the standing stake lines exactly as she had found them. And below the figures she wrote the plan, plain as a pond is plain, because a thing you set down in ink cannot shift on you in the night, finish and floor the graining ponds and move the works up onto the firm bench fed by the strongest spring. Turn the brine down the leader ditch and let the sun and the wind harvest it. Scrape and wash and dry and sack the white salt through the winter, and quarry the clean bed beneath the crust where the brine ran slow, and sell it to a camp of mills that ate salt like bread, and would eat more of it every month as the ore turned meaner. And to the ranchers she could already feel a hard winter coming down on, out there in the valley with their herds, a winter that would have them begging salt to save their stock. She capped the little bottle of ink and closed the book on it and lay down in her blankets in the cold ringing dark, with the deed and the notebook under the corner of her bedroll and $1 proud margin keeping her company in the tin. And she listened a long while to the thin wind going over the salt in the black. That dry, cold, tireless wind everyone swore made the place a poison, the very wind that was going to draw her fortune up out of the brine, and somewhere before the fire burned down to a red eye she slept. And in the morning, when it was light enough to lay a hand to the first bank of the first pond, the work would begin. The cold woke her before the light did, the flat, dry, killing cold that comes down out of a clear desert sky the moment the sun is gone and lies over the alkali all night like a thing with weight. And Naomi Corbett lay a while in it under her blankets in the lee of the stake lines with her breath standing white above her face, and listened to the one sound that never quit out on that ground, the small ceaseless tick and creep of the crust as the frost worked it, and away under everything the low sob of the wind combing the open playa. She did not throw off the blankets and go find the shovel. Her father had taught her that a pond dug in the wrong ground is dug twice, once to dig it and once to walk away from it, and that brine led down a crooked ditch is brine given to the sun to steal, and that a morning spent looking is never a morning lost. So on that first full day of her ownership she did what Ezra Corbett would have done, which was nothing that showed. She took up his ledger, and a whittled rod marked off in feet and in inches down its length, and she pulled her father's old canvas coat close about her against the dawn, and she walked her flat from the low poison margins, where the crust lay bitter and gray, clear up to the firmer benches under the rim rock, and she read it. She read the lay of the water first, because everything on that flat began and ended with where the brine rose and where it ran. The playa lay in the bottom of the basin flat as a struck floor, white and blinding under the first slant of sun, and up along its eastern edge, where the ground firmed and lifted a little toward the rim rock, the brine came up out of the earth in a scatter of springs, cold and heavy and clear, welling and spreading and losing themselves out over the open flat where the sun took them. A body who had stood at the margin and tasted the bitter gray crust and called the whole basin poison ground was not wrong about the crust. The surface of that flat was death. A caustic, bitter alkali skim that killed grass and blistered a cow's muzzle and turned a spring seep sour. But her father had walked those springs in every season with his rod and his notebook and had proved to his own patient satisfaction the thing almost no man in the district would have believed, that the flat's curse and the flat's fortune were the same ground stood on its head, that a basin bitter enough to poison the top of it was a basin holding, down under the bitter, a bed of clean rock salt and a standing brine so strong it wanted only the free sun and the free wind to grain out white. The poison was the whole problem, and the poison was the whole answer, and only a man patient enough to taste every spring and gauge every seep had ever seen that the one lay directly under the other. And everywhere she walked that morning she found his Sundays waiting for her in the crust and the clay, the same as she had found them the night before in the dark. His old stake lines stood weathered and leaning along the ground where the conductor ditches were to run, a split stake driven every few rods with the grade notched into it in his hand. His trial ponds lay dug and dried and drifted half full of dust. Shallow squares scraped into the playa with the gray ghost of old salt still crusted in their corners. His figures in the book told her the strength of every spring gauged by the rod in the heat of July and again in the cold low water of the turning year. The depth of the brine standing beneath the crust bored down to at a dozen marked places. The reach of the clean rock salt bed under the flat where his bar had struck it. She checked his numbers against the ground the way he had taught her to check anything before she trusted a dollar or a day to it, and she found them right. All of them right. All but one. He had sighted his graining pans low, down in the belly of the open playa where the flat ran widest and the ground lay dead level, because it was the easy place. The place a man could scrape a pan into the crust with a mule and a slip without cutting into a foot of hard bench. Naomi stood on that low ground a long while in the cold with the ledger under her arm, and read the flat the way her father in his mildness had somehow never made himself read it, and she saw the thing he had missed. A graining pan scraped wide and shallow out on the open playa lay too far from the strong springs and too near the poison. The brine had to crawl a long crooked way down to reach it, and the sun and the seep robbed it thin along every foot of that crawl, so that a weak spent brine came at last into a wide, shallow pan, with a mile of surface for the wind to work, and no depth to bank a strong liquor. And there it grained slow, and worse than slow, for a weak brine grained low on that poison ground, took up the bitter alkali out of the very crust it lay in, and the gray taint out of the mother water, and what came off the floor of it was a coarse dirty salt with the poison grained into the heart of it, salt a mill would sniff at and a rancher would not lay to his meat. Up along the eastern firm, 200 paces above his low pans, the ground lifted to a hard clay bench standing clear of the poison margin and lying not 50 feet below the strongest of all the brine springs, a cold, heavy spring that ran nearer a true saturated brine than any other seep on the flat. A works laid up on that bench, fed straight and short and downhill off that one strong spring, could take a rich brine while it was still rich, before the sun and the crust had a mile to thin it and foul it, and pans cut up there deeper and narrower than her father's wide, shallow squares would bank that strong brine deep and hold its heat and hurry its graining, and the salt would come off them white and clean and quick, the good sodium salt graining out first and got up off the floor and washed before ever the bitter end liquor could crystallize down into it. It would cost her a harder dig into the hard bench, and a longer reach of conductor ditch cut true to grade, and the grading of ground her father had not meant to grade. She would grade it, and that night by the tallow light she wrote under his last figure, the first figure of her own keeping, the one place in all that ground where the daughter bettered the father. And she did not feel proud so much as she felt continued by it, as if the two of them were still arguing brine across a jolting wagon seat, and she had at last, and quietly, taken a point off him. Then she went to work, and the work was the whole of her life from that first hard frost down through the short days toward the snow, and it was work about water and salt both, every stroke of it, done alone with a mule and $40-odd in a tobacco tin and a dead man's book. She began with the ditches, because nothing grained until the brine ran to the pans clean and lost none of itself on the way. She set her line off the strong spring with the level and her father's rod, and cut her conductor ditches down the bench to the pan ground, graded just steep enough to lead the brine along at a walk, and no steeper. For a ditch cut too flat lets the brine stand and steal away to the sun, and a ditch cut too steep tears its own banks to mud and carries the mud down into the pans. And she puddled the bottom of every ditch with clay dug and hauled and beaten stiff into the seams the way her father's notebook set the mixture down, treading it and tamping it until the ditch would carry a strong brine the length of the bench and weep almost none of it away into the thirsty ground. Then the ponds stepped one below the next down the fall of the bench. First the settling ponds, broad and quiet, where the brine off the spring stood still and dropped its mud and its grit and its drift of blown dust to the floor, and ran off the top of itself clear into the pond below. And then the graining pans proper, cut deep and narrow and true, floored hard and banked square, where the cleared strong brine lay to the sun and the wind and gave up its water day by day and grained its salt. She led the brine from step to step through little plank gates she could raise and drop, banking a pan full and holding it and drawing it down, so the salt came in ordered pans and not in one poisoned flood. And every evening she went down the whole stepped run of them with the marked rod, and gauged the strength of the brine in each by how the rod stood in it, and the depth of the liquor by the wet line on the wood. And she wrote every figure down, because a figure set down in ink cannot shift on you in the night the way a remembered one will. And when the salt lay, grained white on the floors of the pans, she harvested it the way the book laid down, and the way the low poison ground had taught her father never quite to manage. She drew the spent, bitter mother liquor off the pans before it could crystallize down into the good salt, and turned it out away down the flat to the poison margin where it belonged. And she scraped the white salt up off the hard pan floors with a wooden scraper that would not cut the clay, and she washed it in a little of the clean, strong brine, not in sweet water that would melt her profit, rinsing the last gray bitter off the white grain, and she spread it to dry on a floor of whipsawed plank laid up off the ground in the sun and the everlasting dry wind, and turned it and dried it hard and clean and sacked it. And where the crust lay lowest and the brine ran slowest, out at the dead heart of the flat, she found the other half of her fortune waiting under the bitter skim exactly as her father's bar marks promised, a bed of clean rock salt lying solid beneath the poison crust, and there, with a bar and a keg of saw iron, she quarried it, broke up through the bitter gray shell, and cut down into the clean glassy salt beneath, and hewed it out in slabs and blocks to be broken and washed and sacked alongside the grained salt of the pans, hard rock salt for the ranches to lay to their stock and their meat, and grained white salt for the mills, 2 salts off 1 flat. She trusted no step of it to memory. She gauged the yield of every pan and the strength of every brine and the tally of every sack. And she reckoned from the strength of the strong spring and the reach of the pans and the pull of the desert sun and whined the one figure the whole winter's labor turned upon. How many hundredweight of clean white salt that flat could grain and quarry and sack between the freezing of the ground and the breaking of the spring, and she worked that sum 3 times on 3 evenings and wrote it plain in the front of the book, and looked at it a long while, because that number was the answer to a question the camp had not yet thought to ask. She was not only building. In the hours she could steal from the ditches and the pans, she was making the flat a place a body could live through a desert winter, because a woman who freezes in November grains no salt in December. She dug a dugout back into the firm clay of the bench under the rim and faced its front with fitted stone hauled off the rimrock and squared timber, and floored it and roofed it with slab and sod and beaten earth, and set a stone hearth in the back of it drawing up through the bank, so that where the raw open cold had stood there was now a low snug room dug into the desert with a plank door, and one small window looking down over the white pans toward the camp and the freight road below. She sank a barrel-cribbed water hole at the one sweet seep above the springs and hauled and stored sweet water against the day the sweet seep froze. For a flat swimming in brine has not a drop a body can drink. She laid in fuel where a country runs to no timber, greasewood and the twisted dead sage, and a wagon load of coal freighted deer up from the camp, and cut and stacked what thin hay the one grass draw above the bench would give, and banked a root cellar into the bank beside the dugout, and broke a little ground at the sweet seep, and planted what would keep, so that by the time the snow came there were things put by on the floor of a basin the whole district called dead poison ground and worthless alkali. And then, to prove the whole of it end to end before she ever trusted it with a season, she ran her first true harvest clear through from the spring to the sack. She banked her best pan full off the strong spring and held it and let the sun and the desert wind work it down, gauging it by the rod every evening as the brine drew strong and stronger. And when the floor of it had grained white, she drew off the bitter, and scraped and washed and dried and sacked the salt. And it came up out of that pan white, as no salt the low playa had ever grained, clean and dry and bright, with the bitter poison rinsed away out of it, and the mill's own article standing in the sack. She stood over the first-ranked sacks of it a while, and did not let herself smile, because one pan was not a season and a thing is not proved until it is proved many times. But she took out the book and she wrote it down. The first line of hundredweight sacked. The first figure in the whole ledger that was salt come off the flat instead of labor gone into it. And she capped the ink and went to bank the next pan. And she learned her flat the way her father had drilled into her past forgetting, which was the thing that made her his daughter more than any ditch she graded or any pan she cut. With the marked rod she gauged the strength of every spring by the day, in the last warm weather and in the hard low cold, and wrote it down. She timed how long a pan took to grain at the turning of the season and how the shortening sun slowed it, and reckoned from it how many pans she could carry to salt between one cold week and the next. She learned which springs ran strong and clean, and which ran weak or bitter, and gauged her own brine seep by seep the way old Tobias Flint could gauge a water hole with one look, and set down the salt standing winnable in that flat to a figure she could stand behind, because a figure set down cannot shift on you the way a hope will. And all the while she graded and dug and gauged, she was reading the other thing, the thing that made the whole cold gamble worth the sweat of it, and it was written plainer across the district every week she came down for staples and iron. She read it the way her father had taught her to read a flow, not with her hopes which wanted it, but with her eyes and her figures. She read that the silver mills were going into a hard, hungry season, the reduction works down the valley driving deeper into the base rebellious ore, the ore that would not give up its silver to quicksilver alone, but had to be roasted with salt before ever it saw the pan, chloride roasted by the ton, so that the deeper and the leaner and the more stubborn the rock they cut, the more salt every mill in the district burned to save the silver out of it, and the salt bill on every ton climbing, month over month, as the good easy ore pinched out and the rebellious ore came on. She read that the salt they burned came from far off and came dear and came now not at all. Freighted in over the mountains from the great salt lake works away to the west, and both ends of that long line failing in the same season, the far works flooded out and shut down for the year, and the mountain freight road fouling and closing under an early snow, so that the imported salt in the mercantile went thin, and went gray, and went up in price by the sack, while the wagons that should have brought more stood snowed down on the far side of the pass. And she read, plainest of all and standing up gray on the peaks above her own rim, the third thing, that the winter was coming on early and hard and killing over a valley full of cattle, a winter that would drive every rancher in the basin to slaughter down his herd before it starved and salt the beef to keep it, and salt what stock he could save to hold it through. And there is no keeping meat and no holding stock through a hard winter without salt, barrels of it, wagons of it, and every barrel of it gone thin and dear and snowed off in the same weeks the mills were burning it faster than ever. Mills eating more salt every month. Imported salt thinning and shut off behind the snow. A killing winter driving a whole valley of cattle onto salt at once. She wrote the three of them down on one page like three dry channels running toward one bottom, and she did not need her father's rod to see where the want was going to rise. There was one other soul in that whole camp who read the same page, and the camp laughed at him for it exactly as it laughed at her. Tobias Flint was an old desert teamster, gaunt and burned brown and near 70, who had freighted salt and ore and everything else across that basin and over that pass back before the camp of Cascabel had a name, and he sat most afternoons on the mercantile porch with his back to the boards and read the year aloud to the young miners and mill hands lounging there in the thin cold sun, and told them plainly what was coming. He told them the mills were driving into rebellious rock that ate salt by the ton and would eat more of it every month till spring. He told them the salt came from the far lake over the mountains, and that both the lake and the road had gone out from under it in the same season, and that he had freighted through dry years and knew the particular pinch of a country that has always had a thing cheap and wakes one morning to find it gone. He told them the winter had a killing look to it, and that a valley of hungry cattle and a herd going under the knife would want more salt than the whole basin had laid by, and that when the mills and the ranches both cry for salt in the same shut in winter, the price of a sack of it does a thing that men who have always had salt for the hauling cannot so much as picture until it is on top of them. And the young men on the porch laughed, the easy laugh of men to whom salt had always been the one cheap thing there was too much of, and one of them jerked his chin-up basin toward the white glare of the Poison Flat, and said the old teamster ought to go partners with the girl who was up there scraping poison into sacks for the coyotes, and the porch laughed again. All of them, at the old man and the poison girl both, at the two people in the district who had done the arithmetic. Naomi heard it, loading her sack of beans into the wagon, and she did not so much as turn her head, because she had a use for that laughter now, and it was not to argue with it. Let them laugh at Tobias Flint. Every figure the old man read off the porch was a figure already standing in her book, and a thing two people see and a whole camp laughs at is generally a thing about to come true. She had one last thing to buy, and near her last money to buy it with. An outfit east of the camp had gone broke and was selling out ahead of the winter, and among the tired horses and the worn harness at the auction there was the very stuff she could not scrape or grade or beat out of the flat with her own two hands and a dead man's book, a coil of good wire cable, sound and heavy, for rigging her scrapers and her slip and dragging her quarried blocks up out of the salt bed, a stack of saw iron, saws and bar steel for cutting the rock salt, worth more to her than coin, with a whole winter of quarrying ahead, and a great lot of salt sacking. The coarse sewn bags and the twine, more of it than a sane body would buy. The one thing between a winter's grained salt and a heap of white on the ground. She drove down to the sale and bid on those 3 things and nothing else. And before she raised her hand on any of it, she went over every foot the way her father had gone over a thing before he trusted $1 to it, sighted the cable for broken strands, and thumbed the saw iron for temper and true, and counted the sacking twice against her figure. And she paid nearly the last of her tin for it, cash on the barrelhead, and wrote the figures in the book, out and out and out, all still going out and none yet come back, and hauled it up onto the flat behind the straining mule and set it in place, and finished her works. And then, near the end of it, with the first hard snow already gray on the high peaks above the rim, and her ditches running, and her pans graining, and her plank floor stacked, and her first white sacks ranked and waiting, she stood one still cold morning at the edge of her white flat, where the bench looked down over the whole basin, and saw the 3 things she had read coming standing up at last in the world where any eye could see them. Away down the valley, the smoke of the reduction mills stood up thick and steady and unbroken over the camp, thicker than she had ever seen it, the smoke of works roasting rebellious ore day and night and burning salt into it by the ton. Along the valley bottom, the freight road that came in over the pass ran empty and fouling, its ruts already greasing over with the first blown snow, no wagon crawling on it where the salt wagons ought to have been, and over it all the peaks stood gray and going grayer. The early killing winter closing down hard over a basin full of cattle that would want salt before the month was out. Naomi Corbett closed the book on her figures and put it away inside her coat against her ribs where a paper belongs, and went back out onto the flat to bank the next pan, and the snow held off one more day, and her sacked salt stood decked and waiting with every grain of it already written down in ink, and the crisis that all her winter's work was built to meet had not yet broken. The salt did not fail slowly, the way a well fails, going brackish and then low and then dry over a summer, while a body has time to dig another. It failed the way true dry things fail, which is all at once and from every side together, so that a country wakes one gray morning to find the thing it never thought about gone out from under it in the night like a floor. Naomi Corbett had read it coming all through the off-season the way her father had taught her to read a flow of water or a grade of ore, not with her wants, which were quiet, but with her eyes and her figures. And she had built her whole white winter to be standing ready in the hour it broke. And still, when it broke bigger and harder and from more directions at once than even old Tobias Flint had prophesied to the Laughing Porch. And there was a day or two in it when the whole silver district of Cascabel stood in the cold and understood, all together and for the first time, that a mine does not run on silver. It runs on salt, for the ore in that country was the mean, rebellious kind, the refractory rock that will not give up its silver to quicksilver alone the way the soft, free milling ores of the easy camps do. It had to be roasted first with salt, crushed and mixed with salt, and fired in the long reverberatory furnaces until the salt and the fire together broke the silver loose into a chloride the pans could catch, and then worked wet in the amalgamating pans with more salt still, so that every ton of pay rock that came down out of the Cascabel hills ate its steady weight of salt before it ever gave back $1. And the reduction mills strung along the creek below the camp ran on salt the way a smith's forge runs on coal. No salt, no roast, No roast, no silver, no payroll for the whole camp that lived down the length of that creek, and all of it, every hundredweight, was freighted in deer from far off, because the district made none of its own, or believed it made none, which, in a country that owned the Poison Flat, came to the same blind thing. The first side to go was the far one. The Great Salt Lake works away to the west, where the district had drawn the most of its salt for years, evaporated cheap off the shallows of a bitter inland sea, and hauled in by the wagon train. Word came up with a played-out freighter on a spent team that the lake had flooded. A wet, warm freak of a late season had swelled the feeder rivers and drowned the evaporating shallows under a foot of loose water that would not grain and would not dry, and the works were shut and dead for the whole winter. The salt gardens under water. Not a fresh sack to be had off them till the next summer's sun came back and burned the flood down again. That was the deep well of the district's salt gone at a stroke, and gone not for a week but for a season. And the men who ran the mills read the freighter's word and reckoned their bins, and did not yet let themselves be afraid, because there was still the near supply, and there was still the road. Then the road went. The mountain freight road that climbed east over the pass toward the rail end and the other camps, the road every ton of near salt, and every barrel of everything else came in over. Shut under an early deep snow, 3 weeks before any winter had a right to close it. A great silent fall that came down soft and heavy over 2 days and a night, and stood the drifts up shoulder high in the cuts, and buried the grade at the summit past any teams breaking. And the mail did not come, and the freight did not come, and the men who broke a wagon up to try the pass came back on foot leading the horses, and said plainly that it was done, that the road was shut till a thaw or a plow, and neither of those was coming soon into that cold. So now the far salt was drowned, and the road that fetched the near salt was choked, and the camp turned, the way a cornered thing turns, to the one salt left inside the reach of it, the district's own stockpile, the sacks and barrels of it already hauled in and stacked in the warehouses down by the mills against the ordinary winter, enough salt to carry the roasting a good long while if a body could buy it. And that was the third side, and it was the coldest, because it wore a coat and kept a ledger. Somewhere in the warm summer, while the district had gone about its business, believing salt was the one thing that would always be there because it always had been, a quiet syndicate out of Denver, the same cool Eastern money that had spent the year buying up mortgaged claims and failing bottoms all through the district, had gone through the warehouses and bought the stockpiled salt, all of it, every gettable barrel, quietly and at the going summer price, and held the paper on it and said nothing. They had read the same 3-sided winter-old Tobias Flint read off the mercantile porch, and they had read it a season sooner and with a colder eye, and they had cornered the one article every mill in the country had to have and could not now bring in over a drowned lake or a shut road. And when the lake flooded and the road closed, and the mills came down to the warehouses with their wagons and their money, the syndicate's man met them at the warehouse door with a pleasant face and a pencil, and let the price climb. He did not refuse to sell. Refusing to sell is a crude thing that brings a rope out in a mining camp. He sold, a little and dearer by the hour, naming a new figure each morning higher than the last, sitting on the whole cornered heap of it the way a man sits on a full cistern in a burning town and sells the water off by the cupful. Because a thing every soul must have and no soul else can furnish is not a barrel of salt any longer. It is a rope around the neck of a district, and the hand that holds it can draw it as slow and as tight as it pleases. So the mills faced going cold. That was the plain, unpicturable fact the camp woke to that hard week, that the reduction works which made the payroll the whole of Cascabel lived on were down to the salt in their own bins. A week of it. 10 days of it, and no more coming at any price a mill could pay, and still meet its own notes. And that when the last of the roasting salt was fed to the last furnace, the fires would be banked, and the pans would go still, and the stamps would quit their day and night thunder down the creek, and the mills would stand cold and dark, and the miners would come up out of the hills to no wage, and the whole camp would go into the teeth of a mountain winter with its one industry stopped for want of the cheapest, commonest, most despised white grit on God's earth. Men who had never in their lives given salt a second thought stood in the cold outside the warehouse and did the arithmetic of it and went gray, and the price the syndicate's man wrote up on his slate each morning climbed like a fever. And in the very same weeks, off the same killing winter, the salt came due from the other side of the valley too, from the ranches. For the early deep snow that shut the pass had come down over a valley full of cattle with the grass already thin, and the cold that stood behind the snow was the deep killing cold that empties a range, and the stockmen who ran their herds on the flats below the camp faced their own hard corner in the same gray hour the mills faced theirs. A rancher going into a winter like that has two uses for salt, and both of them mortal. He must salt down the beef of the animals he cannot carry through, kill them before the cold and the hunger kill them for nothing, and pack the meat in brine in barrels to save the worth of it, and that is salt by the barrel, salt by the wagon load, for a valley of herds. And he must salt the stock he means to save. For cattle want their salt to hold flesh and health through a hard season and will pine and weaken without it. And a weakened cow in that cold is a dead cow by spring. So the ranchers wanted salt as bad as the mills wanted it, in the same weeks off the same drowned lake and the same shut road and the same cornered warehouse. And there was for both of them together not one gettable sack in the district that a Denver pencil did not own, unless a body counted the ranked white sacks standing decked and waiting on a flat the whole camp had spent a lifetime swearing was worth exactly nothing. Into that three-sided corner, on the second bitter forenoon of it, rode a young man on a hard-used horse up the long white road onto the poison flat, and Naomi Corbett straightened from the graining pans and watched him come the way her father had taught her to read anything before she trusted a word of it, not with her heart, which had no particular cause to warm to a strange man riding up her father's road, but with her eyes. He was young, not 30, and built long and hard the way men are who have handled heavy work for their bread before they ever hired other men to handle it, and he was dressed a shade better than a working mill hand and wearing the good coat like a debt, worn shabby at the cuff, and his face under 2 days of stubble had the particular gray, sleepless look of a man who has stopped lying down at night, because lying down means lying still with the figures. He got down stiff at the edge of her working ground and took off his hat, which not many men had troubled to do for her that whole winter. And he did not waste her morning with soft words, because he did not have a morning to waste. His name, he said, was Amos Rourke, and he ran the big reduction works down the creek, the one large mill in the district, the one that took the most of the refractory ore and carried the largest share of the camp's payroll on its books. He ran it, he told her, flat. The way she would come to learn, he told everything. A true weight set down plain on the deck for her to see, and not a grain of it shaved to spare himself. He ran it on a mortgage, the whole works pledged to the last pan and stamp against the money he had borrowed to build it, and on a milling contract with the district's mines that had a forfeit bond written behind it, a bond that came due and payable if his mill failed to reduce the ore it had contracted to take. And his mill was going to fail inside of 10 days for want of salt. The drowned lake, the shut road, the cornered warehouse, he laid the three of them out for her plain as she had already read them, unless somewhere in the whole snowed in, burned off, bought up country there was salt a man could still get his hands on that no freighter had to reach. He was, he said, a ruined man by every figure he could work. The mortgage foreclosing and the bond forfeit, and his name, which was the only true capital a young millman owns, about to be worth exactly nothing on any camp in the mountains, unless the thing he had heard down at the wagon yard was so. For he had heard it from a freighter, who had it from a drover, who had it off old Tobias Flint himself, that there was winnable salt on the Poison Flat. Not the poison crust every fool knew was up there and would kill grass and cattle. Winnable salt. Salt a body could actually get and sack and haul, which every soul in Cascabel for a lifetime had sworn to a certainty could never be gotten off that dead white ground at all. Naomi Corbett set down the wooden scraper she had been working the pans with, and looked at him a moment, this gaunt, proud stranger come to the end of himself on her father's flat. And then she did not answer him with her mouth. She answered him the way her father would have, which was to turn and walk him 20 steps to where he could see the whole of it, and let the works do the talking. And there it stood, the thing the camp had laughed at Ezra Corbett for a lifetime of Sundays without ever once riding out to look at, the conductor ditches leading the strong brine down off the spring in graded runs, the stepped settling ponds and the narrow graining pans banked up on their firm bench, skimmed with the first thin white ice of grain salt taking the morning, the plank drying floor, and, ranked in the lee of the sod store house in ordered rows taller than the man, the sacks, hundreds of hundredweight of clean white winnable salt, sun-dried and washed and sacked all through the off-season by one girl and a mule, standing decked and waiting on the exact hour that had just now come. She let him look at it until she saw the arithmetic change behind his gray face, saw the ruined man understand in one long breath that he was not standing at the edge of a fool's poison ground at all, but at the one full salt deck in a district where every other grain of it was drowned or snowed under or locked behind a Denver pencil. Then she told him, level and unhurried, the shape of the thing, because a desperate man needs an order laid down for him more than he needs a kindness. Yes, she said, there was winnable salt, more of it than his mill and the whole valley's ranches together could swallow before the thaw, and more standing behind it in the rock bed and the brine than any of them had the winter to use. But he would take it her way, off her flat, on her count, at her price, or he would not take a sack of it at all, and the first thing he would learn, before ever a wagon rolled, was that the sun and the brine ran her flat, not his hurry. The salt came off the ponds in its own time, and no faster. The brine ran down the conductor ditches at the rate the spring gave it, and stood in the graining pans the days the winter sun took to draw the water off and bank the grain, and a man could no more rush a pond of brine to grain overnight, because a mill was baying at his heels, than he could rush the sun across the sky. She would harvest and wash and sack it in ordered lots by her own reckoning, and weigh out every hundredweight on her own scale beam, and enter every pound of it in ink in her book at the head against the name of the mill or the man who took it, and she would sell it, when it was ready and not before, at a fair price by the ton, the same price to every soul who came up that road all winter, and no man's hurry and no man's ruin would move that figure a copper up nor down. And then she named the figure, and she named it the way her father had drilled into her past, all forgetting, fair and written, and then not moved off of. She had lain awake more than one cold night doing the harder sum, the sum a colder soul would have done, that a mill with a bond forfeit at its back, and a valley of ranchers with their herds dying, and a whole camp's payroll hanging on it would pay anything, everything, would empty their pockets and pledge their names to the last acre for salt, because there was no other salt to be had at any distance a wagon could reach before the thaw. She could have named a price by the ton that would have stripped Amos Rourke's mill to its mortgage and left him ruined by her hand as surely as the drowned lake would have, and left every rancher in the valley beholden to her for the life of his herd, and every man of them would have paid it and thanked her for the paying, because the only other article on the whole table was to stand in the cold and watch the mills go dark and the cattle die. She had done that sum in ink of a cold evening, and then she had drawn a line clean through it, because it was her father's rule become her own, that a figure a body can stand behind for the whole of a life is worth more than a figure that fattens them one hard winter and shames the ledger it is written in ever after. She named a fair price by the ton, low enough that a mortgaged mill and a hard-pressed rancher could pay it and come out the far side of the winter hole, high enough that it counted, that it was a business and not a mission, and she opened her father's book there on the deck and wrote it at the head of a fresh page in her small square upright hand. And when Amos Rourke, who had come up the flat, braced to be gouged to the bone, and was grateful past speech to be dealt with straight, tried to press more on her than the figure, tried to tell her, rough and honest, what that salt was truly worth to a man in his corner, tried to round it up in her favor out of the sheer flooding relief of a drowning man who has felt ground come up under his boot. She took the fair price and pushed the rest back across the plank deck with the flat of her hand. The price was the price, she told him. It was written down. And she turned the book and showed him the line, the head of the column and the figure standing under it in ink, and she said the thing that ran her flat without her ever once raising her voice. Write it down, and it cannot shift on you in the night, and no man can ever say afterward that you took him while he was down. He looked at that line a long moment, that gray, ruined, grateful man, and she watched him take the whole rule of her house, the way a man takes bread who has been hunting his whole hard-scrabble life for one solid thing to stand on, and has just felt stone come up under him. The drives began the next morning, and did not stop save Sundays, and here was where the year turned its private joke over quietly in her hands. She hired men off the camp to work the ponds and load the wagons and break and sack the rock salt from the bed, and a good half of the men who came up the white road hat in hand looking for winter wages were the very men who had leaned on the mercantile porch across the years and asked Ezra Corbett, grave and friendly, whether he meant to farm the alkali this season or only pasture the poison on it. Not a word was said about any of it, on either side. Every man of them drew her fair wage and worked her flat by her count and hauled her salt down to Rourke's mill and out to the valley ranches both, and the not saying was its own kind of ledger, a column that balanced without a single figure ever written into it, and she let it lie exactly where it lay, because she had a use for those men now, and it was not to make them eat their old laughter. She had no room in her that winter for spite, and no hour to spend on it. She fed the mills their roasting salt, and she fed the ranches their barreling salt and their stock salt, both off the same ordered harvest, reading the sun and the brine and the daily weight the way her father's notebook had taught her the flat could give, never once running the ponds dry ahead of the grain, so that where the whole district saw only famine there, came steadily down off the poison. Flat, a counted white river of salt. Every ton of it weighed on her beam and entered in ink at one fair price. And in the hard middle of it the winter tried, the once, to take a man from her, and how she met it told the flat more about her than any figure in her book. A hired hand crossing the low ground below the ponds broke through the treacherous crust that the whole camp had always feared without ever understanding, The thin, dry salt shell laid over a soft brine sink beneath, a bottomless caustic mud of bitter water and slime, and went into the waist before he knew the ground had changed under him, and stuck, and began to go down. And the whole crew's instinct, to a man, was the wrong one and the deadly one. They ran to him and laid hold of his arms to haul him straight up out of it by main strength, the way you would pull a man out of a snowbank, which in that sucking brine mud would only have seated him deeper with every heave, drawn him down by the grip of the mud against the pull the way a boot is held in gumbo, and worked him under to drown in the caustic slime before their eyes with his arms near torn from him. Naomi came across the crust at a flat, hard walk and not a run, because a second body running onto that ground was a second body in the sink, and she stopped them level and short and unexplaining, in the plain voice of a body calling a figure off a rule, because there was no minute to spend teaching a thing in a hand that stops to argue with the boss lets go of the rope. "Let go his arms," she said, and they let go. She had them fetch planks from the pond works and lay them flat on the crust out to him to spread the weight wide so no other man broke through, and had him lean back and long across the mud instead of standing up in it, to give the sink less of him to grip, and worked a plank down behind him and a loop of line under his arms made fast to the mule, and eased him. Eased, not hauled, slow and steady and straight along the low angle of the planks and never up against the suck, until the mud let go its grip by degrees the way it never lets go against a jerk, and he came free onto the boards whole and shaking and blue and burned, and lived. And then she did the second right thing, which was the harder one, because a man out of the sink is only half saved, and the muttering on the flat had already begun. His skin was scalded raw where the caustic brine had eaten it, the alkali burns of that bitter mud, and the crew's whole instinct there was as wrong as it had been at the sink, to rub tallow into it, to scrub the white slime off him rough and dry, and she would not have it. She had them flush the burns long with clean, sweet water hauled up in buckets, pour after pour, more water and longer than any man there thought could be needful or even sane, to wash the caustic clean out of the flesh before it could eat deeper, and then a sour wash of vinegar off the store shelf laid over it after, which set the men muttering worse, sour water on a raw burn, until the sting of it drew down and they hushed. And the man was cold too, cold to the deep, the killing chill that comes up through a body soaked in near freezing brine in a mountain wind, and the crew wanted what men always want for a froze man, which is to run him to the biggest fire on the flat and pour hot liquor down him and rub the life back hard into his hands and feet. And every one of those three things she stopped, level and unexplaining, against the whole muttering instinct of the flat, because every one of them kills a man chilled that deep. No rubbing the limbs, for it drives the cold stalled blood back to a stopped heart in a rush that stills it. No liquor, for it opens a man to lose the last of his heat faster. And no roaring fire flung against him all at once, but a slow, careful warming from the middle out, dry wrappings and warm stones close about the body, and the heat brought up by patient degrees the way you thaw a thing you mean to keep whole. And she sat by him through it and read him the way she read a pond, and by dark he was warm and sore and cursing weakly, which is the sound a saved man makes, and every muttering man on the flat had gone quiet. And in the days after, when the whole crew and half the camp had taken to marveling at the folly girl who had pulled a man alive out of the poisoned ground and knew a doctoring nobody else on the flat had ever heard of, there was one man among them all who did not marvel out loud. Amos Rourke, whose mill her salt was keeping alight, shoved up the shabby cuffs of his good coat, and did not ask her to tell him again how clever she was. He asked her how the works worked. Not who taught her, not how a girl came to know it, how the brine ran down the graded ditches, and why the pans were narrow and deep instead of wide and shallow, and how she read the grain coming, and where the strong spring fed in, and how the rock bed lay under the crust, and how a body broke it clean. And she told him, and telling him she watched him take it the way a starving man takes bread, whole and fast and grateful, and then he did the thing that told her the shape of him for good and all. He went and worked it. A mortgaged mill man with his own works, idle for want of what her flat gave. He came up the road and learned her ponds and her brine run joint by joint through the short cold days, by the sweat he left frozen in the pond ice and the salt-cracked skin of his own hands, until he could read the flat near as true as she could. And then he carried the true plain word of it down the whole length of the district, mill to ranch to wagon yard, that the Poison Flat was no folly and never had been, that there was a working salt works up there, run fair and run right, and that the district's whole cornered winter was broken. And by lantern light in the sod house at the end of those days, Naomi Corbett opened her father's book and set down the weights and the figures in her small square hand, and saw the thing the whole long winter had been built to bring around quietly turning over on the page under the light. The book that all the off-season had been one lengthening column of what she had spent, dollar out and dollar out and dollar out, filling now, line on fair line, into a book of what she was owed. Salt news travels the way salt itself travels in a dry country, slow, and by every road at once, and it changes the worth of everything it touches long before it ever arrives. By the time the first ordered wagons of Naomi Corbett's white salt had gone down off the flat and up the camp road to the reduction mills and out along the frozen valley to the starving ranches, the whole district knew a thing it had spent a lifetime laughing at, which was that there was winnable salt on the Poison Flat, pure white salt grained out of the free sun and the standing brine for almost nothing, scaled out fair by the ton, written in a book. And in the working out of that one plain fact, the entire standing of the country turned itself over inside a single burning winter, the way a whole white pan of brine will hang clear and still for days, and then, when the cold comes down just right, go over all at once into salt. For years the arithmetic of that district had been as settled as the peaks it stood under, and every soul in the silver camp of Cascabel could have recited it to you in his sleep. The men who owned the good things owned the good living. The syndicate out of Denver owned the deep mines and the mills that reduced their rebellious ore. And it owned, besides, the one commodity the whole roast and pan district could not run a single day without: salt, wagon loads of it, freighted deer over the mountains from the far Salt Lake, works to feed the pans that beat the silver out of the roasted rock. And that autumn, reading the killing winter, coming the way a card sharp reads a marked deck, the syndicate had quietly cornered it, bought up every stockpiled ton of imported salt in the country, and locked it in its own sheds and sat on it, meaning to let the mills and the ranches come crawling and pay whatever the syndicate cared to name. It was a good plan in the way a great many plans are good, which is to say it was good in every season but the one that came, because a cornered thing is only worth the getting of it to a buyer, and that winter the getting failed on every road at once. The far Salt Lake works, that was to have refilled the sheds all winter long, drowned dead under an autumn flood, and then froze solid, a whole sea of salt mud locked under water and ice 100 miles off, and no more use to a mill than the moon. The mountain freight road that hauled it in drifted shut under the first deep snow and stayed shut. And so the syndicate that had cornered the district's salt found itself owning a stockpile it could not add a pound to and could scarcely haul a pound out of, priced so high and banked so far behind flood and drift that it might as well have been sown in a dead man's coat at the bottom of a lake, really and truly theirs, and no earthly use to anyone. The mills burned clean through their own last imported reserve inside a month. The men who owned the good salt now owned only the salt they could not reach, and the one inexhaustible bed of it in all that country, deep pure rock salt under a standing brine that the sun and the wind would win for the cost of the scraping, lay where it had always lain, under the dreaded white flat that every man in Cascabel had been so relieved to see handed off to a girl of 19 for nothing. There was a man in the camp whose whole trade it was to know, before anyone else knew, exactly where the sound money in a country had gone to lie. And that man was Ezekiel Pryor. He was banker and land agent both, notary besides, all of it done from one comfortable desk in the squared front of the Cascabel Bank, and he was pink and easy and slow blinking, with a heavy watch chain slung across the front of him like a chain across a locked gate, and he had priced Naomi Corbett cheap the day she laid her father's deed on his counter, and had not troubled to price her twice since. But his vault that winter had gone quietly rotten in his hands, and Ezekiel Pryor knew it the way a man knows a bad tooth with his tongue in the dark. It was stuffed to the doors with paper, mortgages, liens, notes, the whole folded weight of the district's borrowing, and every sheet of it was written against a thing that the winter had killed. Notes against the mines that stood cold and salt-starved. Notes against ranches whose herds were dying in the drifts for want of salt to hold them. Notes against claims burned out, snowed in, or simply dead, secured by ground that could not raise the interest on a lamp wick. A banker with a vault full of paper is a rich man only so long as the things behind the paper are worth the ink. And Ezekiel Pryor sat at his comfortable desk through that hard winter and did the sum a banker does when the ground goes soft under him, and read the same three converging flows the old teamster Tobias Flint had read aloud to a laughing porch back in the fall, and saw plainly where the one solid dollar left standing in the whole district had gone to lie. It had gone up onto the Poison Flat. It was grained white and sacked and stacked and written down in a girl's ledger, and it was the only thing in the country that the winter had made worth more instead of less. So Ezekiel Pryor, who had laughed a $40 laugh across his counter in the fall and pressed the folly on her as a kindness, put on his heavy coat and had his sleigh horse rough-shod and drove out himself, up the long white flat road under a hard bright sky, to buy the thing back for the syndicate before the rest of the country finished understanding what it was. He came to her at the scale house by the graining ponds, where she stood in her father's Mackinaw with the marked rod in her hand and the day's brine grade half red, and he did not laugh this time. He took off his hat, which was itself a kind of confession, and he laid his errand out the way such men lay a thing out, sliding gently in at the low end and meaning to walk her up. It had been a hard winter on everyone, he said, and he had been thinking of her father, rest him, and of a young woman alone against so much weather, and he had come to do her a real kindness at last and take the whole cold worry of the flat off her hands. He would give her, he said, and here he named the first figure, a soft round number, a few hundreds of dollars, a sum that would have looked like a fortune to the girl who had counted $41 behind the mercantile in the fall. Naomi Corbett heard the number out and did not answer it, and did not warm to it, and did not cut across it, and the not answering must have troubled him, because he climbed. He allowed as how the flat had proved handier than a body had thought, and that a fair man raised his offer to meet the facts, and he named $1,000, cash on the barrel and the paper drawn that same afternoon. She heard that out too, level and unhurried, the way she would hear a hand call a wind off the far mesa, and she wrote nothing on her face at all, and so Ezekiel Pryor did the last thing a cornered dealer does, which is show the whole of his hand and call it generosity. $2,000, he said, $2,000, and there was no shame in a young woman taking it, for it was more than her father had cleared in a life of being laughed at. And behind the offer he added, leaning the weight of it on her the way you lean on a gate that will not swing, stood names she would know if she read a newspaper. Eastern names, syndicate names, men whose money did not run dry with a season, men it was a great deal wiser to sell to than to stand against. He laddered his whole vault up in front of her. Hundreds to 1,000 to 2,000 and the Eastern names on top of it, and Naomi Corbett stood at her own scale in the cold and heard him all the way down to the bottom of it, without warming and without cutting in, the way you let a poor grate of brine run clear off the rod before you read it, so there can be no argument afterward about what the figure was. Then, when he had spent the last coin of his persuasion and stood waiting, she did the one thing he had ridden $2,000 up a frozen flat entirely unready for. She did not raise her voice, and she did not name a price to match his. She turned the ledger around. It was a heavy book by then, her father's ledger grown fat with the season, and she set it on the scale house plank and turned it to face him, and opened it not to the last page, but to the first line of the winter. And she walked Ezekiel Pryor down through it with the tip of one cold finger, line by line, the way her father had taught her a person walks another person through a true account, so there can be no mistaking it. Here, she said, was the first ton of salt she had scaled out. And to whom, and at what price? Here was the salt that had gone to Amos Rourke's mill the week it would otherwise have gone cold and thrown the whole camp out of work, at the fair written price, the same price by the ton that stood at the head of the column. Here was the salt that had gone to the ranches to hold their dying stock, the same price. Here was the mill again, and here a second outfit, and here a string of ranchers named one after another down the page, and every last line of it the same fair figure in the same small square upright ink, a whole winter of salt sold straight to the mills and the ranches alike at a price a burned country could pay and still come out the far side whole. She turned the pages under his eyes until he had seen the shape of the thing entire. Not a corner and not a gouge, but a fair scale run fair all winter long, and then she closed the book, and she named him her price. $40, she said. His own $40, the very 40 he had pressed on her across his counter in the fall as a kindness, not a copper more, and not a copper less, payable to him in full on the day the brine ran dry and the desert sun went out. That was her price for the poison flat, she told him, level as a scale come to rest, and it would stand at exactly that figure so long as the sun should rise over the eastern rim and the salt should grain in the pans, which was to say forever, which was to say never, and he was welcome to enter it in his book against the day. Ezekiel Pryor sat a long moment with the sleigh robe cooling on his knees and the whole $2,000 gone dead in his mouth, understanding at last that he had ridden out to buy the one thing in the district that was not for sale at any figure his rotten vault could raise, and then he put his hat back on and turned the horse and drove down off the flat, and by the time he reached the camp the story had somehow got there ahead of him, the way the true stories always do. It was too good a joke not to run, and run it did. All that winter and for years of winters after. How the banker had laddered his offer to $2,000 and the Eastern names besides. And how the folly girl had turned her ledger around and offered him back his own 40 the day the brine ran dry and the sun went out, told and retold and laughed over at every mill door and wagon yard and bunkhouse stove and freight office from the pass clear down to the plains. An airtight little joke with no loose end anywhere in it for a man to argue, because it was only the plain truth said plainly, which is the one kind of joke that never wears out. There was one more soul who came up the white flat road that winter needing what the girl on the flat had to sell, and that was Cordelia. The stepmother had kept the good things, the way the will was written, the snug home ranch, and the going freight business with its wagons and its teams. The one truly valuable article Ezra Corbett had put together in his mild, unhurried life, and for a while in the fall those good things had looked like exactly what they were, which was a great deal finer than a deed to poison ground. But a freight business hauls other men's goods, and when the mines go salt-starved and the road drifts shut there are no goods to haul, and Cordelia's fine wagons stood idle in her fine yard with the snow banking up against their wheels. And a cattle herd, however good the ground it grazes, must have salt to live, and there was no salt to be bought at any price in all the district that a fine inheritance could reach. None, that is. But the salt grained white on the flat that Cordelia had folded into a girl's palm in front of the neighbors and called her father's folly. So Cordelia came up the flat road too, at last, the way they all came, and Naomi Corbett met her at the same scale, by the same graining ponds where she had met the banker, and the whole camp 2 miles below held its breath over what the girl would do. For here, if anywhere, was where a person might be forgiven for salting a little spite into the measure, or for weighing an old debt out heavy against a stepmother who had turned her out of doors with a coin pressed in her hand. Naomi did neither. She scaled Cordelia out her salt at the fair written price, the very same price by the ton that the mills paid and the ranchers paid and every other soul in the country paid that winter. No spite salted into the weight of it, and no old wrong forgiven off the figure of it, not a grain heavier and not a grain lighter than the honest column in the book. She weighed it true and wrote it down in ink under Cordelia's name, the same as she wrote down all the rest, and let the stepmother load it into her idle wagons and haul it home to her hungry cattle, and said nothing over it that needed saying. And the camp, reading that account the way a camp reads everything, understood it entire. The thing between those two women was closed now and squared, and paid in full, forever. Not with a blow and not with a kindness, but with a fair figure weighed out fair on a true scale, which is the only way an honest ledger ever settles anything and the only way it ever needs to. And then, at the quiet end of that loud winter, there was Amos Rourke, and the last account of all got settled in the same plain hand as every other. He had stood by all that day the banker came, near enough to have stepped in, and he had not stepped in, not out of coldness, but out of the truest respect a man ever pays a woman, which was that he would not stand at her shoulder for a fight she plainly had no need of any help winning. He had seen from the first that she did not want rescuing off that flat and never had, and he had let her win her own, fight her own way, and been glad, standing quiet by the scale house wall, to watch her do it. He had learned her works joint by joint through the whole hard season, on his knees in the cold brine with his hands in the ponds, until he knew the run of that flat the way she knew it, by the sweat he had left frozen in it, and a man who has learned a thing that way does not court in flowers. So he came to her one still evening, when the day's salt was sacked and the low sun lay red and enormous along the whole white run of the flat, and he asked her plainly, in the count and the plain words of the work they had done side by side all winter, the way a man reads a true figure off a scale and says it out loud so both of them can hear it stand. And Naomi Corbett said yes to him the same way, plain and level and without one wasted word, The way you call a true figure off the scale rule when the beam has come dead to rest, and there is nothing left to argue. Yes, that was the reading, and it was written down now, and it could not shift on either of them in the night. They were married out on the flat itself in the last thin light of that winter, out on the white salt under the enormous desert sky, with old Tobias Flint, the silent desert teamster who had watched her wagon climb out of camp that first gray morning and had said the one true thing about the coming salt famine to a porch that laughed at him, standing up to give her away in his good dark coat. And among the little company of hands and mill men gathered on the salt to see it done stood the young fellow she had eased out of the brine sink that near fatal morning, standing up sound and brown and whole, which of all the figures in the whole book was maybe the one she was gladdest to have written down. And that is very near the end of it, but not quite, because a country goes on after a story leaves it, and this one is worth the telling out. The boom did what booms do. The great silver that had made Cascabel roar died down the way silver always dies, a little at a time and then all at once. The rich ore pinched out in the deep drifts. The assays thinned. The reduction mills that had run day and night until the ground seemed to have a heartbeat shut down one by one, their stamps going silent up the gulches. And the Eastern money that had cornered the salt and owned the mines and stuffed the banker's vault folded its paper and climbed aboard the cars and rode back east to find some other roaring place to own, the way it always does, leaving the mountains quieter than it found them. The camp shrank, the saloons boarded up, and the survey stakes rotted, and the great head frames leaned and grayed against the sky. But the flat did not die, because salt does not follow silver, and never did. Silver is a thing men want only while the wanting is in fashion. Salt is a thing men need, plainly and forever. The ranchers need it to hold their herds, and the packers need it to put down their meat, and the growing towns need it on 10,000 tables. And the railroads that came at last and stayed need it by the ton for 100 humble uses that have nothing to do with any boom. And so when the silver was gone and the mills were cold and the Eastern money was a rumor, the one white flat everyone had given away for $40 stood on, graining its salt in the sun as it had grained it before there was a camp to laugh at it, the single sure thing in a country of gambled and busted and abandoned things. A real town grew up around the works in the slow years after. A small, steady town that did not roar and did not bust. And when at last the county came to draw its map and asked what the place was called, they did not call it Cascabel, which was gone, nor Poison Flat, which had never been true. They wrote it on the map by the name it had earned. They wrote it Corbett's. And if you were ever to go there, they say, into the general store that still stands at the head of that steady little town, you would find hung on the wall behind the counter, framed under glass, and gone the soft brown of old paper. A single page torn long ago from the front of an old ledger, the first page, in a small square upright hand, with the date of a bitter first night of ownership at the top of it, and, written plain below, a mule and $41 in a tobacco tin, and a plan. And the folks behind that counter, children and grandchildren of the girl who wrote it, will tell you if you ask the whole 3-generation tale of the $40 offer, and of the banker who laddered it to 2,000 and the Eastern names, and of what she offered him back and when. And they will tell you, with the particular quiet pride of people who have checked the thing themselves, that the brine has not run dry yet, and the desert sun has not gone out yet, and that out past the edge of town the white flat lies graining its salt in the light this very day, exactly as it did the first cold morning a girl of 19 knelt down and put her bare hand into the brine and believed it. So that is the whole of it, told out the way I had it, and I hope it kept you warm a while tonight. Before you go, do an old storyteller a kindness and tell me down in the comments what country you're watching from this evening and what the weather's doing outside your own window, because I do love to know how far these stories carry over the mountains and the years. If you're new to this hearth, subscribe and pull a chair up close, for there'll be another tale next time. And until then, whatever the winter's doing at your door, you keep your own lamp burning kind.